Right, let's get stuck into Arsenal, who finished the season on a high. Just the 5 goals against Brighton, but they did finish 5 points adrift in 3rd place. But so lovely to get the battering for Brighton in what was WSL legend Vivianne Miedema's final game. She got herself on the score sheet with her first touch just 2 minutes after coming off the bench. And if that isn't kind of like a kick in the face for Arsenal, I don't know what isn't. I mean, Rach, could that have been the perfect, that you couldn't have picked a more perfect end for Miedema, do you think?
No, I think you'd want a Miedema goal, ideally set up by Mead, and maybe throw in an assist as well, and all of those things happened. She celebrated as well, which we don't always see from Viv. We don't always see her celebrate. She absolutely celebrated that one. You know, seeing the emotion from the team, the emotion from the fans, like it tells you something when you've got, I mean, obviously she did a speech at the end, but when you see other players in tears, fans like absolutely gutted, you know you've made a real impact on a team. And I think, that would have been the absolute perfect way that she wants to finish at Arsenal. It was a real 2 fingers to Arsenal. Here's what you're missing, love. Bye.
Here's what you could have had.
Yeah.
It did feel like such an emotional game. I mean, there was an applause in the 11th minute around the ground, marking the shirt number that Viv wears, and she obviously received a massive ovation when she came on in the 62nd minute, and she received a massive standing ovation when she scored that goal. I mean, she was in her element. This was a player who just went out to have fun and show the club what an error they'd made. I mean, there's this beautiful video on X/Twitter of Viv kind of winking at a fan who was kind of holding up a sign saying Viv in, Jonas out. And I felt like you saw the real essence of her personality, because like you said, Rach, like she's not one for the big goal celebrations. She's not one for the, the kind of the big post-match interviews. Like she's very low-key, very calm, very understated. But this was like a real kind of Viv, cheeky, in her element, enjoying herself, seeing out what's been like an historic reign at the club. I mean, were you a little bit emotional?
I think just seeing it doesn't matter what club, like when you watch Magda and Pernilla say their goodbye speech to Chelsea, you're just like, oh my god, it's just really sad to see leaving the fans, the impact that she had on the club, the impact that fans have had on the players, all that kind of thing. And when you see a legend leaving a club, it's always emotional. I think what makes it even more difficult for Arsenal fans is that it's not like she's, coming to the end of her career and going somewhere to finish off. Yeah. She's peak condition, and they're potentially going to lose her to a rival, which will make it harder to swallow. And Jonas was asked about that in the pre-match press conference, and he kind of said, there's a lot of different reasons and factors that come into these decisions, but I don't think they're worth discussing now. And you're like, well, actually, I'd argue they probably are, because people want to know. This is why the fans are annoyed. They can't understand it. And
I was going to say, there has been this massive, overwhelming sense of controversy around the decision, and a lot of it is kind of centred towards Jonas. I mean, we kind of saw a little bit of a controversial video come out of a little bit of argy-bargy between Eidevall and Viv on the bench. That, as you know, that's come out. A lot of people are criticising Jonas for his kind of behaviour in that, and sort of Viv, looking to stand up for herself essentially and saying that's not okay. And then Jonas has been kind of suspiciously quite quiet about the whole announcement. You always expect a manager to go, thank you so much for your service, you've been an incredible player, thank you for what you've given the club. And there was just this kind of overwhelming, quite loud silence from Eidevall. Do you think sort of the fans are going to turn against him for not being more supportive of what's been happening with her?
I don't know. I think he had an opportunity to explain it to the fans, and I think whether or not they agreed with his reasonings, at least they would have had reasonings to wrap their head around. I think the fact that nothing's really been given is going to be frustrating for them. Obviously, it's been announced Stina Blackstenius has signed a new deal this morning. There was kind of an either or with those two, which I never really understood, because they're not, exactly the same type of player. They offer you something very different, but obviously that's his preferred number 9. And I do think he could have maybe clawed back some of the fans' feelings of negativity if he just explained a little bit his rationale or the reasonings behind the scenes, whether they were his or somebody else's. So I think that was disappointing. And the thing is, these announcements and the way they're done, they tell you so much without really saying anything. And the fact that there was no comment in Arsenal's statement about Viv, no quote from him, there was no reference to Jonas in Viv's statement. It's very clear that they didn't really get on, and that was a really uncomfortable video from Everton. It was really poor from him and not something you want to see again. But I think it screamed a lot about what was going on maybe behind the scenes. So fair play to her. I thought she handled it really well. She hugged him at the end of the game. She's a bigger person than I if they have had clashes. But yeah, I think he'll be judged on how Arsenal do next season and I guess how Viv does next season, wherever she does go.
I was going to say, I think her next announcement could be the bigger kick in the teeth when that gets dropped. But if we kind of step back a bit, I suppose, from Arsenal and how they've achieved and what they've kind of done this season, how would we assess it, I suppose? Because the expectations on them were obviously so high. I mean, obviously myself, I expected them to be winning a WSL title. But do we feel like they've kind of regressed from last season? They kind of had the Champions League run in. That ended very, very early. And, you know, do we feel like actually they underachieved this season? Or do we feel like actually, you know, they still did okay, despite a bit of turbulence with the club and some inconsistencies?
They did okay. I do think they underachieved. I think last season they overachieved, given the number of injuries they had to deal with and how far they got in the Champions League and the fact they'd won a trophy and that they pushed it all the way to the, you know. So in that respect, but then you pretty much have done the same thing this season without Champions League, with a better squad. And I do think they've underachieved. I think the quality in that squad, they're good enough to have won the league and to have won more. You do have to factor in that they did have new players come in, bringing back players from ACL. That's a difficult thing to kind of, you can't just bring them straight in. They have to have minutes managed, and that's a difficult thing to manage, right? And you had 4 players to do that with this season, which is tricky. And all of them had different journeys. So that is a difficult thing. But they played well enough. Their problems, I think, are the fact that they're not clinical in front of goal. That's a glaring issue. And I think they struggle to really change the game plan in game sometimes, and too many times we've just seen them lobbing balls in, crossing, and you're like, it's obviously not working, play through the middle. Like, that's the kind of frustration about Arsenal, is that the quality's there, but for some reason it doesn't seem to click on the pitch. So yeah, I would classify it as an underachievement, but I think they'll be pleased that they picked up a trophy. I mean, what about, you're the one who thought they'd win the league. You must be disappointed.
Well, I was just like, how can you not win the league when you essentially have, like, you field a squad of 11 attackers, essentially, like, every game. Like, there was just so much firepower in that squad. And, like, I do have to agree, like, you know, I was expecting there'd be plan A, B, C, D down to Z with the amount of, like, different combinations that you could have threaded together. And sometimes it felt like Eidevall was kind of relying on just making, like, a triple or quadruple sub and just expecting that was going to completely change the game, when actually it made things a lot more confusing for them at times. So, yeah, I think there was just definitely disappointment, definitely underachieved, but I think the potential is still there, and it feels like they're still figuring things out. Like, at the back, I feel like they're getting a little bit more rigid, like obviously Leah Williamson stepping back in and sort of being a little bit more consistent. So I do feel like, you know, the best is still to come for Arsenal. But let's turn our attentions now on to Brighton, who are obviously on the other end of the battering that Arsenal gave them this weekend. They sacked manager Melissa Phillips back in February after close to 10 months in charge when they were sitting in 10th place. They've just finished the season in 9th, having picked up 11 points in 12 games before Phillips' dismissal and 8 points in the 10 games after. I mean, it's clear that nothing much has really changed or improved since Mikey Harris stepped in. Poor guy. I remember the press conferences when he first came in, and he was sort of being brought across from the academy with about 3 hours notice.
All he could
kind of say at the press conference, that people saying, okay, how much involvement have you really had in the women's team? And he was like, well, I saw them once passing the field next to the academy a couple of weeks back, and I think we waved to each other, and everyone was like, okay, well, we'll see how this goes down. But what do we kind of make of this sort of... I feel like they've just kind of languished. They've just plateaued. They've stayed there. There's been a lot of turbulence, but yeah, I can't say that I've seen much really happening after Mike Harris has come in. And to be honest, I'm not surprised.
Well, this was a really unusual sacking because they kind of stated things about, like, the goals that they've not been scoring or their XG, or it felt like a really data-led sacking, which is quite unusual in the women's game, given data is something we probably don't have enough of. Quite honestly. So for it to be a reason to get rid of someone...
And also you don't have enough time to really collate data when you've been 10 months in charge. Like, you haven't even let them finish out a season worth of data.
And a good chunk of those 10 months was the summer when they weren't playing. And like, when you look at Mel Phillips' time, I'm pretty sure they scored 13 goals under Mel Phillips, and they scored 13 goals under Mikey Harris, 7 of which came in one game. So if you're looking, like, data-wise, you would say, well, has Mikey done enough to keep the job? Well, surely not, based on the reasonings they got rid of Mel. So I don't know. I don't know if he's going to be the permanent manager, whether he wants it or not, or whether it's what Brighton want. They've had enough time to go out and try and find someone. And I think they've made a hash of getting managers in and getting rid of them really quickly in the last few years. So they need to get this right. And I hope that they've been spending a long time going out and eyeing up people. And they're going to need to get a manager in who's on board with the way that they want to play and the way that they analyse and the way that they look at success and what success looks like for them. And we've talked about it before, that like wanting to challenge in this league, it's great that you're investing off the pitch, obviously hugely important, but you also need to be bringing in the right players to do that as well. So yeah, I'm not hugely surprised that Brighton didn't suddenly go off on this amazing run after sacking their manager. But I'd love to know how they kind of look at the second half of the season and whether they feel like they did the right thing.
Well, I think even by Harris's own admission, he was kind of saying, well, we've underachieved this season after the Arsenal game. And, there's sort of questions asked about whether he's going to kind of become the permanent head coach. But I think, given what you were saying, and I absolutely echo your sentiments, there's a part of me that feels like, does he even want to be the permanent head coach? That was never in his kind of career ambitions. It kind of felt like this role was, thrust upon him very last minute because he seemed like the best fit for the job because no one else was kind of in and around it and they weren't prepared. But I don't feel like there's really this massive cohort of like experienced, incredible managers who were kind of ready to step into this role. Like I feel like there's a bit of a gap really, like unless you look into kind of Europe, I suppose, or maybe this is where Montemurro could be thinking about, the kind of comeback king, the kind of man to take them to like, I don't know, to restore them to this like beautiful glory kind of thing. But like you said, I think it's just a shame because the club does have the infrastructure there. You've got people like, Paul Barber, who's in Women in Football. Like it seems kind of like, you've got people in the right places who are saying the right things. The investment seems to be there. And yet you kind of see time and time again, season after season, that they never really get themselves out of kind of the relegation mid-table zone ever. They never really feel safe, Brighton. And I don't feel like sometimes they've been particularly that exciting to watch. Like they're not generating that same level of excitement like other clubs kind of do. Like Aston Villa haven't achieved this season, but Christ, they've played some really exciting football at points, and so have West Ham and teams like that. So yeah, there's a bit of a lull.